Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Mind Matters, Navigating Head Injuries and Concussions. I'm your host, Kiley Como. I'm the legal nurse consultant here at Shane Smith Law, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Jeremy Hertza. Dr. Hertza is a board-certified neuropsychologist and is the executive director of Neurobehavioral Associates in Augusta, Georgia. With over a decade of experience working in clinical, academic, and forensic settings, Dr. Hertza specializes in traumatic brain injury, concussion management, rehabilitation, and neuropsychological assessment for both pediatric and adult patients. He's also the clinical associate professor of neurology and psychiatry at the Medical College of Georgia and has served as president of the Brain Injury Association of South Carolina. His expert spans clinical care, education, and advocacy for brain injury patients. Dr. Hertza, it's great to be able to speak with you today.
Pleasure being here. Thank you.
Excellent. So I think given the depth of our guest's expertise and experience, we're going to have Dr. Hertza back on for a second episode, make this kind of a two-part discussion. So for the first part of our time together, I'd like for us to focus more on just kind of an overview, broad understanding of brain injuries and how you go about evaluating those in general. So I think the first question I'd have is, can you describe the process of neuropsychological evaluation for traumatic brain injury and concussion patients from your perspective?
Sure. So anytime you're assessing concussion, you need to look at, true variety of factors. You need to understand the nature of the accident, the physics that went into it. You need to understand the symptoms that occurred within, this first couple minutes of the accident itself. And to give you some examples of that, some of the things we look at are acute concussion signs. So examples of that would be, did they lose consciousness? And to be clear, you don't have to lose consciousness, right? You can have alteration of consciousness where you're kind of disoriented and you're not really sure what's going on. Immediately after the accident, we're always asking about, is there headaches? Was there nausea? Was there vomiting? Was there balance changes? And you also look at what's called retrograde and anterograde amnesia. So retro, like it sounds, is the past. And you're trying to understand if there was any type of loss of memory for 45 minutes, an hour prior to the accident, and the same after, which is anterograde amnesia. And the reason that happens is when the brain goes through trauma, it's trying to keep us alive. So, it's taking all of its energy and it's focused on your organs and your safety. It's not worried about forming memories of what you ate for lunch, right? Mm-hmm. It's worried about, hey, are we okay? And in trauma, often what happens is oxygen is actually pulled from the brain and it's pushed to your muscles. Why? Because, you're not sitting there. Great example. You don't sit there and put your hand on the stove and go, I think my hand's on fire. Maybe I should move it. You just move it. And that happens because oxygen is pulled from your brain, pushed to the muscles so they can react as quickly as possible. So the same thing happens in concussion where there's this automatic self-preserving process. And so we want to understand, are there acute signs? One of the things I see often in concussion and that I'm asked about often in trial is I'll say, Dr. Hertza, for the first week, couple weeks, a month, they were reporting a lot of thinking problems. They were talking about their pain in their back and their shoulders and their neck. They weren't talking about the fact they can't focus. They weren't talking about slow processing or memory loss. Help us explain that. Help us understand that. Help the jury understand that. And there's a very logical explanation, which is that immediately after injury, you're worried about, first of all, immediately after the injury, your adrenaline is pumping. And when that adrenaline is pumping, it's not uncommon for someone to say, I'm fine. I feel fine. I don't want to take the ambulance. Just get me out of here. I want to get my car home, or I want to get a ride somewhere. Get me out of here. And then the next morning when they wake up, they really can feel what happened to them. 2 is during those first 4 to 6 weeks in particular, you're worried about your pain. Mm-hmm. And your pain is far more salient than maybe any subtle neurologic signs relating to how organized your thoughts are or your processing your memory. So once that pain starts to get better managed, people often really fall into an awareness that it's actually way more complicated. There's more things going on. So for me, I need to understand all that. I need to get a really thorough history of all these different factors. Concussion by nature does not show up on MRI or CT. You can have it be complicated where you have like a skull fracture or something else, but that's not typically, the way it is.
Right.
There are some tests out there. There's vestibular ocular testing. There's, diffuse tensor imaging. There's some things out there that could give us some extra added data to support it. But there is no one end and be all test that says, yep, you had a concussion. Instead, it's a collaboration of evidence that supports, what happened and helps us understand the cause. So for me, it's pulling that data together and understanding it. Now, going back to your question, sir, how do I, as a neuropsychologist, assess these things, right? Well, first, what we do is, again, gather this really important history, talking to the patient, talking to a collateral, a family member, someone else, understanding the full medical history that led up to this. 2 is that we do what's called a neurobehavioral exam. What is that? That is where you're sitting there interacting with your patient, understanding what you see. This is important because in the last, how long has it been since COVID? 4 years, 3 years, right?
Yeah.
So during that time period, a lot of new things came out, particularly that are computerized or that are through video. And while those are useful, they are screenings only, right? They're not a replacement for a full assessment. And what they don't capture is what you see, right? It's just data. And the data doesn't tell you, yes, this is a concussion or not. It just says there's something funky. So for neuropsychologists, we have this extended period where we are observing what's going on, right? And a neuropsych assessment typically runs 4 hours, 5 hours. And that's also really important because you don't go to work for 45 minutes or for 30 minutes or 15 minutes that one of these screeners takes. You go to work all day. So we need to understand what happens when you're stressed, what happens under pressure, what happens when you have to sustain, right, for long periods. So the brief assessments just don't replace a full comprehensive look at everything. So that is the neurobehavioral status section. Next is formal testing. And the tests that are chosen correlate to different parts of the brain and how they work. So we're truly doing a functional brain map, understanding your frontal lobe, how it focuses, how it organizes information, your language centers, how you can come up with words. Do you understand? Can you process your memory, your processing speed? And as part of that, we look at emotions and personality. And that runs, again, maybe 4 hours, 5 hours. And lastly, there's an impression section that pulls all these things together. One of the strengths of neuropsychology is we could really differentiate what's contributing to things and what's due to what. I'll give you some very salient examples. I have a case right now where this is a child with autism, and the child had lots of problems as a kid, lots of psych problems, was hospitalized as a child, once tried to jump out of a moving car, like lots of problems. Wow. Then he gets in this terrible accident. So I'm the guy that can determine, well, what's old and what's new? How do you figure that out? I could determine those things, right? We know that side effects of medications, such as gabapentin, slow down thinking. Well, how do you differentiate that between concussion? How do you make sense of their sleep apnea? How do you make sense of the fact they had ADHD before? People don't exist in isolation. We bring our histories, our good and bad, right, into these accidents, and understanding how it all factors together is important. One last example. I have a case that I'm on right now where a person had a terrible stroke about, I think it was 2014. And that stroke was in the frontal lobe, the anterior cerebral artery. And it caused significant frontal lobe damage that, frankly, through treatment had to be rewired. Now there's a terrible accident. So the lawyer asked me, we're having a conversation about a week ago, and he says, one of the real arguments that the defense is making is you had 3 people in the car, 2 are completely fine, and you have 1 that's really impaired. Help us understand that. I said, easy, it's the stroke. The person had problems there to begin with. So their brain was more apt for deficits, right? It couldn't fight it off. There was already weakness there. And so when you combine your past with your present is how you understand what's currently going on. I hope that answers your question in a very long-winded way.
No, that was very good. Much appreciated. I like how you got into pre-existing conditions also there at the end. So oftentimes, our clients come to us, like you said, you bring your whole self. when you're coming to the table, all your past experiences, your issues, your injuries, your illnesses, and oftentimes we see the other side trying to pin these issues on those pre-existing conditions, and it's very frustrating for our clients. So having these very important, very in-depth exams like the neuropsych testing are key to building a good case, and more than that, to getting these folks better. So I totally appreciate you going into that.
I can explain it. It makes sense. That's
exactly
what we're trained in.
And I also love how you mentioned, and because I try to throw it out there as often as we can for our audience, a lot of our audience is made up of people that are going through this right now, survivors, or have a family member in there, other litigators. Those they'll go to the ER, or maybe it's shortly after they've gotten wrecked, they'll get this MRI or CT scan. Oh, it's normal. It's unremarkable. Well, you must be fine then. It's so frustrating. So you need those more objective tests, as you mentioned, to really dig down into that. So much appreciated.
Yes, sir.
So when you're talking about cognitive and behavioral symptoms, what are some of the most common things that you might see persisting, that post-concussive syndrome, if you will, that legal teams should be aware of in personal injury cases?
Problems with attention, mental organization, processing speed, variable short-term memory, difficulty controlling emotions, and emotions that are big and don't match the situation. That's your hallmark. And the reason that is because the front part of our brain is most sensitive to injury. And the brain sits, like, if you look inside the skull, it's not all smooth.
Right.
So the front part has the bony ridges called the cribriform plate, and it sticks straight up, and it's right underneath, right above where your eyebrows are. And so when you're in an accident, that brain just grinds against those ridges. And so most of us, either ourselves or children, or we know somebody that has ADHD. I think if you grew up in the 80s and 90s, I think half the population had ADHD. But we understand that and ADHD is a frontal lobe disorder. So we see those similar symptoms. People are scattered, they're kind of all over the place. Their thought sequencing isn't as good. And so it's the change that we notice that is consistent with that post-concussive syndrome. Less common are focal language disorders or focal visual perceptual disorders, because the areas there in the skull are smoother. Exactly right. So it's more likely to be the frontal mediated symptoms, but also processing speed. So the way the brain is organized, the wires look like a mushroom. And so if you think about your spine, right through the middle, you have all your tracks, and then that connects to your skull, and all those wires run up like a mushroom stalk and then fan out. The reason you lose consciousness in concussion is you have a disruption to what's called the reticular activating system. And that's a bundle of fibers that's there just anterior to the medulla and the pons, so in the brainstem, right? And when that's disrupted is why you lose consciousness. And if you think about it, well, what happens when your wires are messed up, right? And wires in neurology is white matter. So if anyone here on this podcast ever heard the phrase white matter, that's your wires. Well, basically it turns into an old house. You could buy an old house, you could put a new light fixture in, you could put a new light bulb in, the lights still flicker. Light fixture's fine, light bulb's fine, it's a wiring issue. So that variable cognition, that variable processing speed, the damage to the wires of the brain. So those are really the most salient symptoms.
That's excellent. And I think you got me thinking about the mechanism of a car crash, for example, or maybe not even a car crash. Maybe it's a football injury or an athletic injury or something. There doesn't need to be a direct impact to the head, correct, to have these sorts of injuries.
Not at all. So, we know even from the military and blast injuries that those can cause, permanent lasting cognitive deficits. And the brain sits in fluid. And I don't know if, again, I don't know how old you are, but for me, back in elementary school, they had this really disgusting Jell-O. And in that Jell-O, they had like the worst fruit imaginable.
Yes.
And there were these grapes that were completely the wrong color that no one should ever eat. But if you took that, I see you nodding.
Taking me back.
Terrible. It's terrible. Anyway, so if you take this bowl of Jell-O and you move it back and forth and you look down, you'll see tracks. Why? Because that terrible fruit is a different density than the surrounding Jell-O. And so it shears, it tears, it causes these openings. So in the brain, when it's moving around inside the fluid, the different pieces, the different aspects of the neurons, they shear, they twist, they stretch. That is what diffuse axonal injury is. It is the fruit moving inside the jello. And you do not need actually penetrating or actual focal head trauma for that to happen.
That is awesome. I love that analogy. That is great. Number one, retro memory there, but that's a great analogy. Yeah, that shearing. You'd mentioned the diffuse tensor imaging earlier. Some of our clients are starting to see it's not a very widespread technology out there, but it has shown a lot of promise, especially like going to trial, with that white matter shearing injury.
So you can really see it. It's visible.
Exactly. Can you talk a little bit about that? Are you familiar with the DTI?
Yeah, very much. We order those often.
Okay.
And what it does is looking at the wires, at the white matter of the brain, and it's an in-depth look at, well, have they been stretched? Have they been sheared? And on MRI and on these different things, you could see it. And typically it looks like little white dots or hypointensities, and you could actually visibly see the damage. Now, for me, my testing shows it, right? I could objectively prove that there's damage to these areas. But it's a whole nother thing if you could physically turn something to the jury and see right there. Yesterday, I was in trial, and in this particular case, an individual, there was somebody that stalled out in the middle of the road, and he was following his daughter, and his daughter slammed into that car. It was on the freeway. She had no lights on. He tried to avoid her, swung, jumped the median, and got hit by a semi. Okay? So terrible injury. And for him, we could actually see in DTI the damage. We could see the stretching. You could see the blood. You could see how the frontal lobe was damaged. And that lined up exactly with my test results. The reason neuropsychology is so important, and the reason it doesn't matter how sensitive imaging gets, is because all brains are different.
Yes.
So injuries do not always equate to functional impact. That's important, right? You can have two people that had the same injuries, but the impact on them is drastically different because everybody's different. It's the three people in the car where the one person had terrible problems and the other two are completely fine because of history of stroke. Everybody's different. So with neuropsychology, where it really shines, sure, we can prove there's brain injury, but what we can really answer is, how does it affect someone? What is the functional impact? And that directly turns into what type of care are they going to need for the rest of their life? It directly turns into what type of supports, accommodations are they going to need to be successful? So it takes an injury and turns it into meaningful, quantified data.
You mentioned, the timing of care earlier. In the hospital system, in the ER, you have that saying, time is brain, right? Especially when we're talking about stroke. It applies here as well. I mean, the brain, if it's injured, it needs early intervention. I mean, that's the key. So can you kind of talk about that importance for our audience of early intervention and that ongoing monitoring with respect to improving outcomes for concussion, TBI, et cetera?
Yes, sir. So we'll start right after the accident. So you're in an accident, you have a fall, whatever in the world happens, right? I had a guy recently, he was out there just putting a chair out in front of his office and a tile fell off the roof and landed on his head. Crazy things happen, So immediately after injury, your brain freaks out. I mean, you do too, but your brain freaks out. And you have a neurochemical cascade. And the brain overdoes it. So it depolarizes, it repolarizes, it releases these ions, and it goes all these ups and downs because it overcorrects, undercorrects. And that ultimately leads to decreased oxygen to the brain, right? And you could actually see decreased blood flow. And that runs roughly 9 to 14 days, typically 9 days. So the first 9 days after a concussion is when you're the most sensitive because the neurochemistry is resetting itself. So if you get hit at all, anything else happens during that period, the likelihood for severe life-altering changes is dramatically higher. And then we talk about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, we talk about the NFL, we talk about repeated concussions. That window is incredibly, incredibly important. Now, there are critical periods of recovery. The first 3 months being the most significant, and then the first 6 months. And those are the periods where the brain is most likely to rewire. but the research supports that brain injury recovery is basically 2 stages. The first stage runs up to 2 years. And during those first 2 years, let me give you an analogy. Let's say we're on 20 and there's a giant pothole in the middle of the freeway. You got 2 years to fill your pothole. After 2 years, it's too bad, you better form a detour. And you can. Anytime you learn something new, you are forming new neurons and strengthening the one you have.
Yes.
So the first stage of recovery is fixing the pothole. The second stage is saying the pothole is what it is. Help me come up with a detour. Now, like any detour, it's a giant pain. You're never getting there as quickly as possible, and now you got to deal with more traffic. So it's never going to be as efficient, effective as what it would have been had we done that primary repair. But that doesn't mean that people can't be more functional in their life. So I'll get cases 2 years, 3 years after injury, and I need to figure out, well, how can we help somebody? How can we support them? Sure, it's one thing to sit there in court and help a jury, help a judge, help other lawyers understand how the person's been affected. But always in my heart is taking care of my patients. So it's also about helping them have the most successful, functional life that they can, regardless of what they've been through.
That's a fantastic answer, Dr. Hertza. I think that's a perfect point to put a period on the end of this part of our conversation. I love leaving our audience with a little bit of hope, in that it's never too late. There are advocates and experts out there that can help people that have been injured, have brain injuries that are still dealing with and struggling with some of those symptoms even years later. So thank you for that last bit especially. So, well, everybody, that's going to do it for another episode of Mind Matters, Navigating Head Injuries and Concussions. Again, I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Jeremy Hertza, for joining us today and sharing his expansive knowledge and expertise with us. Please look for him and his team at the Neurobehavioral Associates in Augusta, Georgia, or on nbageorgia.com. I hope that our audience has enjoyed listening to this informative and enjoyable discussion and is coming away with a better understanding of brain injury and an appreciation for the innovative treatment options available today. Please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our latest content. Leave us a comment today to let us know what you thought of our discussion. And as always, remember, if you're in pain, call Shane at 980-999-9999. Thanks for listening.
In pain, so I call Shane. 980-999-9999. In pain, call Shane.